Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Hello again from the Skeptic Zone Podcast. Richard Saunders here with you from Sydney, Australia. It's episode number 518 for the 23rd of September 2018. Coming up on this week's show, well, a bit later on, I'm going to be talking about the history of the Skeptic Zone since it's almost 10 years now. It's over 500 episodes, but it's not quite 10 years. On the 26th of September this year, it'll be 10 years since the first episode of the Skeptic Zone went out. I'm going to be talking about the history of the Skeptic Zone. And I just noticed, looking through the archives today, that the first episode of the Skeptic Tank podcast, the show which preceded this, I put out on the 15th of September 2005. And that lasted 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 episodes or something like that. But more about that coming up later on in the show. But before all that, we're going to kick off with a report from the Raw Skeptic. The Raw Skeptic Report with Heidi Robertson. She's going to be telling us about a recent council meeting in the Byron Shire where the motion was put up that council facilities should not be rented out to the anti-vaccination crowd. And Heidi spoke in favour of the proposition that the council facilities should not be rented out to these people. How did it go? Was she successful? What did she say? Coming up in a moment on the Raw Skeptic Report. Also, we talk about the recent destruction of Sydney. Yes, well, a couple of days ago, a giant tidal wave, is there any other kind? A tidal wave was supposed to devastate Sydney, costing 400,000 lives, taking 400,000 lives, wiping out suburbs, destroying the Harbour Bridge and the airport and so on. This was a prophecy being put around, scaring people over recent months. Well, of course, the 20th of September came and went with only the normal activity off the coast. We're going to be talking about this prophecy and some of the real dangers when people go around raving about the end of the world. Then it's Skeptics in the Pub. Maynard heads for Sydney Skeptics in the Pub, and he chats to Nathan Senetz, who is a First Nations man who works at the Australian Museum here in Sydney in First Nations history and First Nations archiving and things like that. And he gave a very interesting talk at Skeptics in the Pub a couple of weeks ago. And he's going to be chatting to Maynard about some of the issues he confronts when cataloguing and archiving and doing research into First Nations history here in Australia. And it was a very interesting talk. I must say the whole audience was captivated by what Nathan had to say. And it was a very worthwhile talk indeed. Anyway, a bit about that with Maynard's spooky action. Now, I must send out a huge congratulations to my dear friend Celestia Ward from Squaring the Strange podcast, who had a baby just a few days ago. And I saw the photograph of Mum and Bub, as they say, and it just warms the heart. Congratulations, Celestia. Oh, and that reminds me, I'm going to be on Squaring the Strange in a few weeks. We did a pre-record because of the impending birth. I think they've been archiving some episodes, saving them up, and I had a wonderful hour chatting to Ben Radford and Celestia Ward about the $1 Million Challenge, and that will be coming up on the Squaring the Strange podcast in the near future. One to look out for. Well, that's enough for me at the moment. I'm going to run downstairs, make myself up some instant miso soup. Very nice. Slurp that down, come back and bring you the rest of the Skeptic Zone.
It's the Raw Skeptic Report with Heidi Robertson.
And joining me now all the way from the beautiful north coast of New South Wales, it's the Raw Skeptic herself, Heidi Robertson. Hello, Heidi.
Hello.
Well, nice to chat with you. We rarely do this. We don't do it often enough.
I know. What's with that? We'll have to do some more interviews. Skype each other more.
We will, but lucky me, I get to see you in only a matter of a few very short weeks. You're coming down to join us at Skepticon.
That's right. I'm so excited about it.
We are too, Heidi. You're always a welcome visitor here in Sydney, and who knows, we might even get you into the media room for a couple of interviews.
Oh, yeah, I'm always up for that.
I know Maynard will be champing at the bit to interview everybody he possibly can anyway.
Yeah, I love Maynard.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about some more serious things. The reason we're having the Raw Skeptic segment this week is the continuing story of your area of New South Wales, the far north coastal region, and the continuing saga, as we say, with the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaxxers, and we know which camp we're in. But I understand, as we're recording, only today there was a big meeting at the local council.
Yes, there was, Byron Shire Council. So there are 9 councillors, including the mayor of Byron Shire Council, and one of the councillors, Councillor Paul Spooner, put a motion forward which basically said that council should no longer allow anti-vaccination groups, specifically the Australian Vaccination Risks Network. They've changed their name to Risks Network now. Specifically them, to stop them from hiring out council facilities in the future, because over the past at least couple of years, council has hired out, mainly the Mullumbimby Civic Hall for events that the AVN has hosted, but also a couple of other venues that they run as well. So Councillor Spooner put forward the motion that council should stop leasing the venues out, and I was there to speak in favour of that motion.
Right, and that was just this morning. So, in fact, Heidi, I understand that you've recorded what you said, not at the meeting, but you've basically made a recording of the words that you said.
Yes, just this afternoon in the car while I was waiting for my son to finish soccer training, I grabbed the opportunity. I grabbed the notes from my talk, and I recorded for you what I said earlier this morning in the meeting, and here it is. Hello, councillors. My name is Heidi Robertson, and I'm here as a representative of the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters Group. We are endorsed by the World Health Organisation as a reliable source of vaccine information. Babies too young to be vaccinated, the elderly, the immune compromised like chronically ill people and cancer patients, all rely on community immunity to protect them. And we have none here, as Mullumbimby has the lowest vaccination rates in Australia. Anti-vaccination groups such as the Australian Vaccination Risks Network, or the AVN, often deny their anti-vaccination stance, instead calling themselves pro-choice. The AVN has shown time and time again that despite calling themselves pro-choice, there really is no ambiguity about their stance on vaccination. They have equated vaccination to rape. They have stated that vaccines are linked to everything from cancer to autoimmune disorders, and even came up with the horrendous term shaken maybe syndrome, to imply that traumatic brain injury from child abusers is actually caused by vaccines. Pro-choice is desirable if you are actually basing that choice on good, reliable information and not putting others at risk. But please also consider the people in our community who had no choice. Please remember Dana and Kalis, who were too young to be vaccinated for whooping cough and died, and the 6 other babies airlifted out of our region with whooping cough during that same outbreak. Denying these groups and individuals the hiring of council venues is not an issue of free speech. Anti-vaccination activists have multiple platforms to share their views online, and they are free to hire any venue they please. We are just opposing them using council venues. Secondly, Australian law does not provide for a comprehensive right of free speech, and even if it did, free speech has its limits when the community is placed at risk. The AVN has an official New South Wales government public health warning against it and its president. Council is thereby facilitating the operations of the AVN in being a threat to the community by spreading misinformation and falsehood in a council area that already has the lowest rate of child immunisation and the highest rate of vaccine-preventable infectious disease. Our region last year had 9 times the rate of whooping cough as our neighbouring health district. There are 2 sections of the Local Government Act that suggest that council may be in breach of its obligations in providing their venues to these groups. Specifically, Section 8A1E, quote, council should work cooperatively with other councils and the state government to achieve desired outcomes for the local community, end quote. And 2, council is providing services and facilities which are not appropriate to the current and future needs within its local community and of the wider public, as required by Section 24. In providing venues for these dangerous views, council undermines government efforts to increase vaccination rates. Councils have the responsibility to maintain the state and federal government's commitment to public health. Last year, an unimmunised little girl was airlifted from this region in a critical condition with tetanus. The next day, international anti-vaccination campaigner David Wolfe was permitted to hire the Mullumbimby Civic Hall. We recently had another AVN event at the Civic Hall, literally at the same time a community member was suffering in hospital from diphtheria. We had the Mullumbimby Council Hall hired to anti-vaccination activist Stephanie Messenger, who wrote Melanie's Marvellous Measles. Measles was not so marvellous for Cecily's daughter Lane, and Cecily is here today. Lane died from complications of measles, being too young to be vaccinated. We had the Civic Hall booked by the AVN for a screening of another anti-vaccination documentary last year. Each time, Council received calls to cancel these bookings. Each time, Council declined. A disclaimer on the door is insufficient ethically and potentially legally. Can any group that promotes views that endanger the community hire council venues? What are the limits, and how does council carry out its due diligence in who hires its venues? Yes, our shire is known for its diversity, tolerance and inclusion of many different groups. However, we should never compromise ourselves and the vulnerable in our community by tacitly endorsing groups and individuals that have the potential to do real harm. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Heidi. That's very powerful stuff. Who else was speaking there?
Yeah, so what happened after so we each got 5 minutes to talk. I spoke for 5 minutes and then the other local gentleman speaking against spoke for 5 minutes. Then the council moved on to all the other matters. So we sat through probably an hour of all these other, I can't even tell you, oh, my goodness, there was people speaking about a local mobile phone tower. They were up in arms about that, but that's another story. So then I was wondering when on earth they were going to vote for everything. I just assumed it was going to be at the end of every motion, but they had a short break and then our motion was voted on after that short break. So what happened was Councillor Spooner first made a little speech about why he was bringing the motion to the table and, you know, basically said that he was disappointed that council had hired out these venues to these groups in the past and that they have responsibility to the community and so on to not allow these groups to spread their misinformation in council facilities. The audience members didn't get a chance to talk at this point. This was all then a debate amongst the councillors themselves. So the Mayor, Simon Richardson, had quite a bit to say. He spoke against the motion and his main points again were free speech, and he brought up the fact that, you know, the Byron Shire, how much it is known for its diversity and tolerance, and we're known for having conversations that are difficult, and that council should be happy to facilitate those difficult discussions in their facilities. So that was really it wasn't. I wasn't really surprised, because I had heard kind of the same thing from the mayor previously, but it was nonetheless, it was pretty disappointing that the mayor of the Shire, this is the mayor of our local government, is willing to keep leasing these facilities to these groups, and local council is supposed to support what the state and federal government's public health initiatives are, and in this case they're clearly not. But so that was very disappointing.
And it's interesting too, just reading your notes, which you were supplying a little bit earlier, because obviously I wasn't at the meeting, it's hundreds of kilometres away. One argument that was put up, which I found quite interesting, was this cherry picking, that they were saying that people in that area are happy to accept the science when it comes to something like climate change, but the same science which says that vaccinations are safe and effective, they reject. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's right. That's something that Councillor Spooner brought up actually to the gentleman that was speaking against the motion. He said, look, why is it that you accept, the science of climate change, but you don't accept the science of vaccination? Should we still be debating climate change? And the fellow actually said, yes, we should. We should be debating everything all the time, constantly. And he is well known for liking a debate and arguing everything that he comes across. So, but it was interesting, because it's so true. People in this area are all on board with climate change and environmental, minimising their carbon footprint and so on. But when it comes to vaccination, no, they don't. And one of the other councillors, she started talking about, what are the motivations of Big Pharma, and why should we blindly accept what we're told? And it was really disheartening hearing that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's straight out of the anti-vaccination playbook, isn't it? All those sort of arguments.
It really, really was. And, the old... she also brought up that, well, these groups aren't telling people to not vaccinate. We should all be doing our own research. And it was exactly the things that you read all the time on the internet from the anti-vaccination crowd. They do say, oh, I'm not anti-vaccination, I'm pro-choice. But, there's no, like I said in my talk, there's no ambiguity about where these groups stand. Equating vaccination to rape and saying that shaken baby syndrome is actually caused by vaccination and not child abuse. You can't really read that any other way than that they are anti-vaccination. Yes.
I mean, they can try to fool other people, but they shouldn't even pretend to try and fool people like you and I and people on the side of science and reason. We know what they're doing. We know their tricks and we know their game. Well, a loss today, Heidi, but the battle goes on, and the very important thing is you were there. You were there sticking up for science and reason and common sense, and, all credit to you.
Yeah, well, I had two other members of our group there with me today for some moral support, and one of those members, Cecily, lost her daughter. She's a local to this region as well. She lost her daughter Lane to SSPE, which listeners might know of as it's a fatal neurodegenerative disorder that is a result of a measles infection. And Lane was 10 months old when she contracted measles in this region. She was literally 6 to 8 weeks off having her first measles vaccination at 12 months of age, which is when they get it on the schedule. She contracted measles and seemingly got over it, but then about 7 years later contracted this SSPE. And It was absolutely devastating for poor Cecily. All these years later, she came to this meeting to support me, and for her to sit there with this anti-vaccination crowd behind us, sort of jeering and, disturbing the meeting and mocking, as they always do in these things.
Yes,
I don't know how she kept her composure, but she did. So that was upsetting, just knowing that poor Cecily, she's lost a child, and she has to endure that kind of that kind of abuse and that sort of disrespect. But that's unfortunately that's a lot of the people in this region. That's the way they act, and that's the way they view the whole vaccination issue, and they do deny the science. So it's just it's a battle. It's an onward and upward battle, and we won't give up. It's just a setback in the grand scheme of things.
I guess so, but it's interesting that what you describe as their behaviour. That's par for the course. That's how these people behave a lot of the time. We've seen that, and there are videos online of them destroying meetings and heckling and screaming and yelling and carrying on. I guess, some of them are quite passionate and they get carried away with their own self-righteousness.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps their. Well, maybe it does because they won the vote today. I don't know. But, I think we certainly at NRVS, we try and, take pride in maintaining our composure and remaining calm and relatively emotion-free at these kinds of things, like the Senate hearing and another council meeting I spoke at a few years ago. And that's all we can do. I certainly refuse to start hollering and jeering and being disrespectful to people whilst they're talking, even the anti-vaxxers. But they don't seem to extend the same courtesy to us.
Oh, well, look, Heidi, don't worry. Your reward won't be in heaven. It'll be in Sydney, and I'll buy you an extra glass of champagne when you're here.
Ah, thank you. I look forward to it.
Okay, well, Heidi, well done. It's a very difficult road that we have, but that's just the way it is. But for now, until we see you very soon, Heidi Robertson, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey, fellow skeptics.
Ben Radford here.
With Celestia Ward.
Your friendly host of Squaring the Strange.
A podcast that looks at topics ranging from legends, panics, and cryptids.
To media myths, psychology, and folklore.
Breaking things down and picking things apart.
As we skeptics do.
We bring a few different perspectives on things.
Celestia, for example, is a witty cartoonist.
And Ben is a brilliant writer and longtime skeptical investigator.
We don't always agree.
But we have fun trying.
And we learn new things.
Join us for new topics every week or two.
Or browse our backlog of evergreen episodes.
Available on iTunes and all your podcast feeding troughs.
Squaring the Strange.
Take care, strangers.
Bye-bye.
A few weeks ago, I told you all about the fact that a flyer was appearing in Sydney letterboxes predicting doom and gloom for Sydney, a tsunami specifically, that would strike at 9 p.m. on the 20th, Thursday the 20th of September. Well, needless to say, Thursday the 20th of September came and went, and no tsunami reported. Now, this prediction, which included the loss of many lives, reminded me of the ongoing problem in society where people or groups predict the end of the world or doom and gloom or disaster. And prompted me and Trish Han and Tim Mendham from the Australian Skeptics to write this opinion piece. From the website of Australian Skeptics, skeptics.com.au, published on the 21st of September 2018. DATELINE Australia for immediate release. Tsunami hits Sydney. Yesterday, September the 20th, 2018 at 8 p.m, a tsunami wreaked havoc along the New South Wales coast from Newcastle in the north to Nowra in the south. Huge regions of Sydney were devastated, including the seaside suburbs of Cronulla, Bondi and Manly. The tsunami surge also wiped out inner harbour suburbs such as Balmain and Kirribilli, destroyed the Sydney Harbour Bridge, as well as the airport, and flooded the central business district. Waves reached as far inland as Parramatta. More destruction followed immediately after, with an earthquake destroying more suburbs such as Newtown. It is estimated that the loss of life numbers around 400,000, with the government imposing a state of martial law. Ends. Missed this news? Didn't notice the destruction last night? Not surprising, as once again dire predictions of doom failed to eventuate. The above disaster comes from a flyer placed in many letterboxes in Sydney in the months leading up to yesterday, the 20th of September. Not only that, a lone figure of a man, complete with microphone and amplifier, was seen around the Sydney Town Hall on several occasions loudly proclaiming this prediction. Behind him stood a banner that read, quote, "Warning, tsunami to hit Sydney 20th of September 2018. Impact 9 p.m. 400,000 lives lost. Everyone that calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Jesus is Lord." End quote. His warnings were punctuated with calls to be saved in the name of Jesus, songs of praise, and rambling about heaven, hell, and unbelievers. While it would be easy to dismiss this self-proclaimed prophet as a nutcase or lunatic, clearly, to go to so much trouble, he was, and maybe still is, sincere in his opinion that Sydney was in peril for whatever reason. And his sincerity and message can have far-reaching and serious impacts for some members of his audience. While the vast majority of people who received the flyer or saw this man in the street would either ignore him and the message or make the odd joke about buying a boat just in case, for some people, a message of impending doom is no laughing matter. Thanatophobia is the irrational fear of dying, often associated with the concern about the apocalypse. This fear can overwhelm people who may be suffering from anxiety, depression, or other mental disorders, and it can be exacerbated by news, social media, or religious prophecies. Stress is often brought on by a feeling of being out of control, with people attempting to take a small amount of control by doing whatever they can to prepare for what they feel is impending doom. The prepper or survivalist movement started in the USA and has made its way to Australia, with apparently hundreds of doomsday preppers across the country making preparations for the coming apocalypse. This could be argued as being harmless, but people suffering from anxiety are at increased risk of manifesting their fears by resorting to dangerous activities such as financial self-sabotage, social isolation, alcohol and substance abuse, and self-harm. Doomsday phobias can even lead to suicidal ideation, and in extreme cases, sufferers may take the only control they feel they have and end their own lives. Various doomsday cults have taken advantage of vulnerable people and convinced them to sell their possessions so they can donate money to cult leaders. This predatory behavior is abhorrent, and while we are not suggesting the latest prophecy is doing that, they are certainly not helping. Australia has had its fair share of predictions of doom, ranging from the second coming of Jesus Christ in 1927, Christ was going to descend from the clouds between the heads of Sydney Harbour, to the family radio billboards on Parramatta Road in 2011, warning of impending disaster in May of that year. The one thing all these predictions, too many to number, have in common is their 100% failure rate. While we may pity the lone prophet, we should also be aware that there are many people who, often in secret, will take the doomsday message to heart and adversely affect their lives and the lives of those around them in so doing. As tempting as it is, doomsday is no laughing matter. and that item was written by Trish Han, Tim Mendham and Richard Saunders, and published at skeptics.com.au on the 21st of September 2018.
Hi guys, Byron Shire here, GP and media commentator, and I'm looking forward to coming down to Skepticon 2018 to share with you my new talk, What Doctors Don't Know. I know the title sounds a little bit clickbaity, something you might expect from a conspiracy theorist, but no, I actually will be discussing things that doctors don't know. You know, in my first year of medical school, we were given this introductory lecture by the dean, and he ended with some really interesting remarks. He said that by the time you guys graduate, half of what you know will either be out of date or be proven wrong completely. And we kind of laughed about it, but by the time I graduated, it was a scary thought. I had so much certainty in everything that I'd learned that the idea that half of what I knew was out of date or worse still, completely wrong was just unimaginable. But of course, after practicing medicine for a decade, I started to see examples of this kind of trickle through. So what I wanted to share with you guys was current medical practices and beliefs of doctors right now that are either not based on evidence or perhaps even completely contradicted by the evidence. And I'll be sharing some really new and interesting examples of things perhaps you guys haven't even heard of. Everything from the placebo effect to appendicitis. But I kind of want us to keep some of the best examples for when we're live in the theatre, in the talk itself. So I really look forward to meeting you guys at Skepticon 2018. Come say hi.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
And of course, as I look around here, I see the person who'll be talking here tonight. Who have we got here and what we'll be talking about? We'll have a longer chat after you talk because there'll be the riot. People will be putting out cigarette butts on you. It'll get pretty wild. But what are you going to be chatting about and who are you?
Okay, so my name is Nathan Sennett. I'm a Wiradjuri man from Central West New South Wales. That's where my family's from. So I work at the Australian Museum in First Nations programs and projects. And what I'm going to actually talk about tonight is how do we promote critical thinking to visitors of places like the Australian Museum, state archives, national and state libraries, places that people look to for history and think of as authoritative sources. How do we get them to be more critical of the information that they receive from these places and from the outside world?
Yes, because you've got to look at who was writing the history, a bit like when you watch the Channel 9 News, you've got to say, who's telling me this? Yeah,
and that's kind of what I look at is like every exhibition at the Australian Museum is curated by someone, and we all have our individual views on things, and how do we promote people not just taking everything they hear as fact, but also what I want to find out from the people here today, because I'm going to be surrounded by skeptics, is how do I achieve this, but also how do I create a healthy balance? So how do I get people to be critical of institutions, but at the same time not disregard institutions completely and feed into things like climate change denial and, anti-vaccination people? How do I, but at the same time, get them to be more understanding of the data they're receiving, to be more critical? Because especially with, stuff like scientific journalism, people, because of how poor it's done and how easily it can be disregarded, people start disregarding science completely. And I'll be talking mostly from a First Nations perspective, because a lot of First Nations people are now getting more control. We're getting more control of the history told by the institutions. So we want to be able to tell our side of the story, and the story that's been absent for a while.
So do you think there'll ever be a time when there will be a really complete both sides told about things like the Frontiers War and that sort of thing?
I think it's becoming more and more likely, and one of the interesting things I'm finding is actually a lot of archives and places like that actually do have that history, but for some reason it's not talked about enough. But I think, because what I want to do is I don't want to disregard the archive, like I said. What I want to do is create a space for pluralism to be happening, and so people have multiple sources and not think of like a single document to be the sole truth, and for more critical thought of history books that do things like, and there are like great historians out there who do criticise people who, you know, use single source documentation to do history books and stuff like that.
Something I'd like to ask you about as an archivist, if you go to a lot of libraries on the local level, there's a lot of good oral history recordings there, and they will actually carry a lot of weight because, here's a recording of a voice of someone talking about something that happened in the 30s. And not a lot of thinking goes into, well, they may be incorrect.
Yeah, well, that's the case.
Because I know I have a lot of funny ideas.
Yes. Well, that can always be the case. When people tell a story, sometimes you're not actually remembering things. You're remembering the last time you told that story. So of course, but this is why everything in archives and libraries and museums should be considered almost complementary of each other. So you need to have lots of different sources to create a whole picture. And if something is the only source on one topic that you know of, we need to create a way to make people more state that more obviously. If you're citing one person for your thing, make that more obvious, but also give people empower people enough the tools to look at that and say, hey, they're really only citing this one guy's journal, or they're only citing this one oral history, and so then they can sort of take those sort of things with a grain of salt,
Okay, Smarty Bum, what would you think would be an example we could point to as someone who's done this correctly with their history anywhere in the world? Is there someone you could say, well, that's a good example to follow?
No, a lot of history documentaries are now, I think, really doing it. Like, I was just talking to a filmmaker historian last night. I forgot her name, but she was talking about how she was deliberately avoiding recreation in her history documentaries because she was finding as soon as she started recreations, it would plant more ideas about a thing, and it basically is an interpretation of the text. So. They were talking about maybe using history documentaries more exploratory and more like art to tell stories, but also to give the viewer more of a sense that this is, it may not be completely fiction, but at the same time there is someone that's creating this. So of course, people naturally have confirmation bias, so it's natural to disregard some stories that don't fit the narrative that you want to tell. And I think as long as we give people the tools to understand that, then they can look at things like history documentaries and not repeat them on in the future as if they're complete fact. And yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, Nathan, congratulations on the chat. You went quite well. You went 3 rounds with the Skeptics and you came out besting them all there. My question was obviously the best one. I asked about revisionism in history, particularly at the Australian Museum. People might have a political agenda to push, and there has to be someone who's a gatekeeper. And that's a tough one because someone has to say no at some stage, don't they? Yeah.
Well, it's also too, as I was saying before, who are these people writing history? And even if we got crazy revisionists in, how do we figure out mechanisms to stop their revision being considered history or fact? Like, how do we stop just one sole source or one single person's ideology being considered fact? And that's why we was talking about things of naming plaques. So then, even if I'm a crazy revisionist, my ideology can be at least critically examined. And so the facts that I'm saying can be weighed up against my ideology, so you can take what I'm saying with a grain of salt and just know, Nathan really liked this subject, so of course Nathan thinks this is the best. Or, Nathan was selling a weight loss powder that was in this, so of course he would say that, more fat.
Yeah. Nathan, such a troublemaker. And also the use of words too, because originally we would have called it Aboriginal history, and I've heard Indigenous history, and I've heard you using First Nation history, which I immediately think back to the American Indian experience. And is that now a word that would be used instead of Indigenous? Is there a political problem with the word Indigenous?
No, I actually don't mind the word Indigenous. I just personally like the word First Nations. A lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders actually think that don't like the word Indigenous because they think it's a governmental word too.
Okay. Right.
But I like First Nations more for the imagery of because there are a multitude of clans, multitude of languages, and I'd like us to be thought of almost as different nations in Australia, and to try and promote that imagery because there is a diversity of Aboriginal culture. It was not a single culture or a single language. So I think using the terminology of nations when it sort of puts the idea of different countries or different nations in people's mind. Yeah.
Of course, with First Nations, can we be sure they were the First Nation? Was there anybody here mucking around when they came along the Land Bridge? Was there some issues going on there? Or that's just so far ago before pre-Dream time that we don't even know?
I know it's a contested history. Like, there is an archaeologist that works at the Australian Museum called, what's her name? Val Attenborough. Val Attenborough will contest that Aboriginal people were not the first people of this land. But it's very interesting, but there is a contestation. And I think what we can do is we can just highlight that contestation. We don't need to say definitively what we can, but we can point to people to that contestation. And because there only are about 3 modes of thought around that sort of topic, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah, because there'd be scarcity of evidence other than like a protracted oral history.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And even Val's evidence is not that much more than thinking about patterns of other nations. So she's not really basing it on any solid evidence either. It's mainly just her hypothesis.
Yeah. And also people would say, she might be politically motivated, but I would suggest not if she's trying to get some evidence together with a proper hypothesis.
For sure. And of course that's the case. But even
it's mainly other people who get up and run with it that might have another agenda.
Yes. Yeah. Well, because it does happen a lot with, especially with different First Nations, is there is an idea, there is people that love the idea of people coming to different countries and taking it over, because then people that have done that historically, it can be said as part of human nature.
Come on, we colonised you, but you took over who was originally here. Come on, fair go.
So there are people that could run with Val's hypothesis, and Val herself would not be that hard on that hypothesis, but other people will take that for their own reason. It's the same with things I can say could be taken by different activists for their own reasons and stuff like that. But we just need to. That's what I want to do. I want to empower people to look beyond those people, to go back to the source of where their claims are coming from, and to figure out what those people were saying in the first place, or why they were saying it.
And where can we find out more about what you're doing online and with the Australian Museum, where we can find out what's going on there and maybe go,
So I am on Twitter at SayWhatNathan, and I run a blog called The Archival Decolonist.
Cool.
And so I follow those things.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for talking to us tonight, Skeptics of the Pub.
Thank you for having me.
Sweet cappuccino, soy latte.
Hey, Richard.
Oh, hi, Trish. Hi. Would you like a coffee?
Yeah, thanks. What are you working on?
I'm trying to come up with a new promo to play on the Skeptic Zone.
Who's it for?
The Good Thinking Society in the UK.
Oh yeah, I know them. The guys who recently chased the homeopaths out of the UK public health system.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, they campaigned and lobbied government for a while, and now you cannot get homeopathy on the NHS. So they can now spend public money on healthcare that works.
Oh, right. Look, I'll mention that in the promo. Now, their website is goodthinkingsociety.org.
And that website is a good resource for learning more about quackery.
Thanks, Trish. That gives me something good to think about. This report comes to us from The Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics, volume 38, number 2, from June 2018. Page 12. In the Zone. Richard Saunders reports on a milestone for Australia's leading skeptical podcast. Oh, that was very nice, the little byline. Over 500 weeks ago, Stefan Soiker and I launched a new podcast onto the internet. The Skeptic Zone was the latest in a small line of skeptical information shows I had produced since the early 2000s. This was all the result of various members of the Australian Skeptics in Sydney appearing on Net FM. an internet radio station on which Soika worked as a DJ. As part of the show, mostly playing the latest hits, he would have members of the Skeptics come in once a week and interview us about skeptical topics of interest, mostly what we call the classics: ESP, UFOs, homeopathy, and so on. This segment ran for the better part of a year. When it ended, I still had a desire to somehow maintain a presence on the internet in the form of a skeptical audio show. So, some months later, Soika and I produced 10 or so shows in MP3 format called the Skeptic Tank. These were not really a podcast, more of a file people could download if they knew the location. Early days. After a time, I tried my hand at producing a similar idea, only this time it was a video show on the Google video site. That site has since stopped operating, called The Tank Vodcast. The show had stories, reporters and interviews. It, however, proved to be an enormous undertaking to produce, and so only lasted about 10 episodes. Then in mid-2008, at the amazing meeting in Las Vegas, I met podcasters Brian Dunning from Skeptoid Podcast, Derek and Swoopy from the Skepticality Podcast, and members of the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Each of these people gave me tips and encouragement about starting again, this time using the popular podcasting platform of Libsyn, which not only housed the MP3 files, but also took care of distribution. People could sign up for the podcast via iTunes, for example. Once back in Australia, I asked my friends what I should call the new skeptical show. For some time, the show was going to be called Skep-Think, until Steph and Soika came up with the name The Skeptic Zone. It struck everyone as being just the ticket, and the show was launched in September 2008. Right from the start, I wanted a show with reporters for variety and to supply content. Over the years, there have been around 20 reporters, and I thank each and every one of them, with Dr. Rachel Dunlop and her segment Dr. Rachie Reports being with the show since the beginning. In more recent years, Maynard, a real radio and TV star, with his Spooky Action segment, has filled many hours of the show with interviews, live reports, and general Maynard craziness. The reporters and I have had the chance to meet and interview so many leaders in the science and skeptical world, from Stephen Fry, Dr. Pamela Gay, Dr. Phil Plait, Dr. Eugenie Scott. The list goes on into the hundreds. We have visited skeptical conventions, haunted locations, mind, body, spirit festivals, paranormal conventions, another list that goes on and on. If you are interested to see if a certain person has appeared on the show, visit skepticzone.tv, click the episodes link at the top, and use the search function. Donating time and energy. The show has also been used, right from the start, to give free publicity to skeptical events and to promote other skeptical and science podcasts, such as Skeptoid, the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Astronomy Cast, Skeptics with a K, the European Skeptics Podcast, and many more. I remember Bob Novella telling me once that if one show floats, we all float, and groups do not ask for any of them to pay for these promotions. The show does draw a modest income from listeners who, if they wish, sponsor the show with micropayments via PayPal and Patreon. It's enough to cover basic costs and lets me provide the reporters with microphones and the odd field trip for an investigation. But all of us on the show donate our time and skills. Producing the show each week is a matter of dedication and discipline. Gathering files from reporters, doing voiceovers, getting up at 4 a.m. to interview someone in New York or London or whatever, editing, mixing in the music, and finally uploading to the world. Once or twice I have used the show to put out a call for listeners to help cover the cost of some special projects. One of these was the production costs in making the Vaccination Chronicles documentary. Once this video was produced, I made it freely available on YouTube and encouraged anybody who wished to copy it to do so. I am pleased that The Skeptic, the very magazine in your hands now, has also benefited from reports and interviews that appear on the Skeptic Zone. But it's not just a one-way street, as I will in turn often read out news and information that appears in this journal, as well as on the website of Australian Skeptics. A good relationship. Thank you to all who have listened over the last 10 years. The show has been downloaded close to 4 million times and found a worldwide audience. It's a wonderful feeling to know that people have the Skeptic Zone in their ears as they drive trucks across Canada, go jogging in Atlanta, do the weeding in Edinburgh, walk the dog in Melbourne, or commute in Stockholm. As for the future of the show, well, no one can know, can they? And that was In the Zone, a report written by Richard Saunders that appeared in The Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics, volume 38, number 2, June 2018.
Hi, this is Dr. Pamela Gay from Astronomy Cast. Each week, Fraser Kane and I take our listeners on a fact-based journey through the cosmos. With our weekly podcast, we explain not just what we know, but how we know what we know about this universe that we share. Check us out at astronomycast.com and look for us in iTunes, Google Play, and wherever you download podcasts. See you online.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone, and as I do often, I thank very sincerely all the people who support the Skeptic Zone financially via Patreon or PayPal at scepticzone.tv. Just click the link there for subscribing, and it means the show goes on. No people supporting the show, no Skeptic Zone. And although, as you would have heard in this episode, myself and everybody else involved donates most of their time for free. Of course, if that was the model, it would be unsustainable. There are costs I have to cover, including my own time. So all those people who do contribute, you'll have my undying thanks. It really does mean a lot. You're not just clicking a button and hope your money goes somewhere. It certainly does go somewhere. It goes right here so I can keep bringing you and everybody else the Skeptic Zone. And as I've mentioned over the last few weeks, the Australian dollar is rather poor against the American dollar at the moment, probably other currencies. So if you subscribe or you donate in American dollars, it gets translated to be a lot more here, or converted, I should say, in Australia. Now, I'm looking forward to meeting Skeptic Zone fans at the upcoming Australian Skeptics Convention, Skepticon 2018, on the 13th and 14th of October, with our big trivia night on the 12th of October, which is free, by the way. And if you'd like to appear on the Skeptic Zone, come to the convention, have a look for myself or Maynard, and I'm sure we'll be delighted to have a quick chat with you. We'll be looking to chat to all sorts of people, and I think there's going to be a dedicated media room, but knowing Maynard, he's going to be running around like a goose with his microphone, so don't be surprised if you end up on the Skeptic Zone. There are still tickets available for Skepticon, and what a lineup of international skeptical speakers we have for you, including the wonderful Pamela Gay, Carrie Poppy, Beth Darlington, Lynn Kelly, Yvette D'Entremont. The list goes on and on. Now, one of the things I'll be doing at the convention is giving a presentation, a preliminary update or preliminary report on the Great Prediction Project I've been doing for nearly 2 years. Gathering and marking and examining hundreds of predictions. At the moment, it's in the vicinity of 1,400, but with the ones I've yet to catalogue, it's probably going to tip over 2,000 predictions I'll be dealing with. Anyway, I'll be giving you an update at the convention about how that's going, the scores to date, and how particular psychics have been faring over the last 17 years with their mystical predictions. And for the technically minded, this week's episode is being produced entirely on an iPad using the Ferrite audio editor. Just thought you'd like to know. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone Podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. Hello everybody who listens after the music. In fact, what's happening? There are planes buzzing around outside. I live near the flight path, and every now and then I'm trying to do records and voiceovers and things for the Skeptic Zone, and I have to stop. Very frustrating, so I might as well use the time productively. It's the old dice game, and those who are new to this part of the show, I have a 10-sided die here. I'm going to toss it 4 times this week, and it gives you a chance to exercise your psychic powers of prediction. Because in a strange sort of way, this has already happened. As I speak, it hasn't. I don't know what number is going to come up, or numbers. Neither do you, but by the time this is put on the internet, of course, this recording will be in the past. Anyway, here we go. I have a 10-sided die. I'm going to roll it 4 times, so predict. I'm going to roll this. Predict the first number. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. 8. 8. Write that down. 8. Okay, next one. Here we go. And 8. Rightio. You just trust me, folks. Here we go. One more time. Number 3. Off the table. Off the table. 6. 8, 8, 6. Right. And come back. And the last one. 3. So if you got 8, 8, 6, 3, you can apply for the Australian Skeptics $100,000 prize for psychic power.